Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here, back with another episode. This one is a Liberation Library episode, which we haven't had in quite some time. I have joining me Keith Knight on the line to discuss and dissect Anatomy of the State. Like what I did there, dissecting Anatomy of the State. so, all right, Keith. So Keith has been just killing it with his YouTube channel lately, and I wanted to ask him before we get into Anatomy of the State, some of the big guests that he's been talking to. So, Keith, welcome back to the Liberty Weekly podcast, and you want to talk a little bit about the awesome work you've been doing?
Yeah, thanks so much for letting me plug these. So I had Jeff Tucker on. We talked about is capitalism moral? That was a really awesome, productive conversation. My goal is to make these important, so if people who come across them a year from now will still see the value in watching them. Whereas if I said, "So what do you think about Trump's this statement? You really think he slept with that prostitute?" Though. Within 2 weeks, those statements are pretty much meaningless because there's a new scandal. So I had Stefan Kinsella on some time ago where we just talked about what libertarianism is. I had Larkin Rose on. We talked about how to talk to statists. We even did a role play. Earlier today, I had Larry Sharp, the guy running for governor in New York, the Libertarian Party. He is excellent. He openly says voluntarism, self-ownership, non-aggression principle. So I think that's great. I had Scott Horton on, and we talked about U.S. foreign policy we started with 9/11, then we got to the sinking of the Maine, Lusitania, Pearl Harbor. It was so good. That one's really long, but it's worth watching because we cite primary sources for our reasons for believing in such things. It really is just a neocon takedown, and his book Fool's Errand is terrific. It's easily the best argument for the existence of blowback theory rather than they hate us for our freedoms theory. A long time ago, I was on Stefan Molyneux's show. We talked once about capitalism. Does it exploit workers? The next time we talked about foreign policy. I had Alex Newman to talk about the United Nations and education. The goddamn people so worried about Russian interference. The United Nations interferes in literally every country. I had James Perloff on to talk about conspiracies, proven, documented conspiracies. Later today, I have Walter Block on. So thank you for letting me get to those.
Oh, yeah, definitely, man. And you're just killing it. Yeah, obviously we've been busy running our own shows and stuff. I did watch the Perlov one from start to finish. That was tremendous. You know, from a conspiracy angle too. But then again, you know, your Scott Horton talk was excellent too, man. It was great. I can't heap enough praise on you. I'm so happy and proud of the work that you're doing, and I want to emulate it, but we're getting there. So, but before we get into Anatomy of the State, though, I wanted to say that this will be put out as an episode of my podcast tomorrow. And the show notes for that will be at libertyweekly.net/LL5, the letters LL and the number 5, or 6 rather, LL6, Liberation Library 6. This video will also be embedded, a video interview and podcast in the show notes page there. So now that that's taken care of, Anatomy of the State. And so a few weeks ago, you tweeted me rather embarrassing, nerdy remark that I made in, I think, one of our last interviews about how I wish that I could just reread Anatomy of the State over and over again for the first time, because it really is a mind-blowing experience for anyone who hasn't been exposed to these ideas before. And how could you go wrong with that cover, man? Is this the copy that you have?
You know, I actually, I just have a close-up version.
Okay.
Or no, I guess it's different. And mine is much smaller. I got it at the Mises Circle.
Okay.
But,
yeah. I got mine on Amazon, but yeah.
So, alrighty, you ready to go through the material? Anything you want to mention before?
Yeah, just a remark is that I really think that a lot of minarchists, and I don't mean to be attacking minarchists here, maybe I do, but critiquing them, I think a lot of minarchists just have not internalized the lesson of Anatomy of the State. And I don't think it's much different than the lessons that Bastiat, espouses in the law. And a lot of the ideas that you see are the same, immediately in the front. You get Franz Oppenheimer, that statement about the political means, and I've cited that in papers, but we're kind of getting into the context. So you go ahead, you take it.
All right. So there's like 6 chapters in here, and just right off the bat, please interrupt me because I could really go on about this. So
Okay.
The first chapter, what the state is not, and this is important because before you say, let's say I was trying to convert you to Mormonism. Instead of me quoting the Book of Mormon saying, see right here, this is what it says, we would want to know if the book in and of itself is a legitimate document, if the events actually happened. In the same way, before talking about what government should do, we should talk about what is government and is it legitimate? Because if it's not inherently legitimate, then arguing about what it should do with regard to hurricanes or prices is pretty much irrelevant. And that's why this is so important, because it attacks the problem at the root. So what the state is not, he goes, most people think of it as an institution of social service, a way of organizing and achieving social ends. He goes on to say, we are the government is often what people claim. So not only is it just and untyrannical, but it's also voluntary because we are it. So to criticize it is to criticize ourselves, which is just a contradiction. And then he goes on to say about we are the government. He goes, any Jews murdered by the Nazi government were not murdered. Instead, they must have committed suicide since they were the government, which was democratically chosen. And yes, he got 33% of the vote and was democratically elected. And therefore, anything government did to them was voluntary on their part. Even if 70% of the people decided to murder the remaining 30%, this would still be murder and would not be voluntary suicide on the part of the slaughtered minority. So the claims that people use to justify the state are totally illegitimate. For a further in-depth analysis on that, this book, The Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer, just goes through 1,000 years of history and obliterates every single state justification argument ever. Yeah. So he defines government. He goes, here's what the state really is. It is that organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. In particular, it is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for services rendered, but by coercion. He says, representative is always subject to that individual's orders. So claiming that is my representative, John McCain in my state, but I can't do anything if he doesn't do what I want, then he's obviously not a representative. This should not be too difficult to analyze. What are your thoughts on we are the government?
Yeah, I mean, you really get into that difference, the double standard. And what I'm going to riff off of what you just mentioned is that, John McCain is not bound by any legal precedent or authority to do exactly what I say. And there's this a mismatch there, because if you hire an attorney or if someone has a fiduciary duty to protect your own interests, there are legal, ramifications if they don't do so. And Tom Woods had a really great episode about this. I think it was just a rebroadcast of a Liberty Classroom episode or Ron Paul homeschool episode, but there is that dichotomy, and you see this in every single respect, police officers getting rights that the rest of us don't have. And I think that's what it fundamentally boils down to, is that if I followed someone on the road and stopped them and seized them because they meandered out of their lane, and I put a gun to their head and I extorted some ticket money from them for having done so, I'm going to go to jail. I don't have the right to do that unless it's my highway, I suppose. And even then, if I put a gun to someone's head on my highway, well, people probably wouldn't drive on my highway anymore if they knew that I had authority to stop cars and put a gun to their head, And so I feel like I'm straying a little bit here, but that really is essentially what he's setting up, is that we have a class of people in our society that have been delegated rights that the rest of us don't have. And
here's where the private property ethic comes in. So Walmart should have a monopoly on what goes on their territory. However, so the anarcho-communist says, see, it's exactly the same as the state having a monopoly. You just believe in private monopolies. The difference is the state has not acquired the land they claim authority over, either by voluntary trade or by original appropriation. That is the root of the property ethic. The fact that anyone even brings up that objection shows that they haven't even gone as far as to Google anything outside of Vladimir Lenin quotes and Mao's Red Book of Success. I can't remember. Quotations by Mao Zedong is the name of the book.
His Red Book of Success. That was great.
Well, hey, man, look at the great leap forward, and then just look at how they rendered under capitalism after that son of a bitch finally died. And for God's sake, stop saying the U.S. doesn't talk to terrorists when I see Nixon hanging with Mao and Roosevelt hanging with Stalin and Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam. Jesus.
Yeah, that irritates the hell out of me. Just the fact that, well, I keep thinking, because I'm learning about Afghanistan now, and this is an aside, but I actually ran into someone who was pro-torture the other day at my law school, and explicitly so. And I said, the Taliban, I said, well, why don't we just bring our troops home? Maybe we can serve the troops better that way. And I wanted to be like, well, the Taliban controls more territory in Afghanistan now than they did in 2002. But
supporting torture is not only something that crazy people support. This is something that Jonathan Yu of the Bush administration said. They said, well, if we take your logic that torture's okay, then is it okay to crush the testicles of someone's son to get them to talk? And he goes, that would depend on why the president would want to crush the child's testicles. So, I mean, really, watch out for terrorists. They're bad people. As this guy's like, yeah, crush the testicles of a child, obviously. Sure. And watch out for female genital mutilators, too.
Well, in this...
this is all part of the state, so we're not really getting off topic.
But, yeah, I mean, it ties into this. Who else would be able to do this legally sanctioned, It is legal to do that under the state. And I really wanted to tie this into the minarchist thing, because I really think that minarchists have not internalized exactly what the state apparatus is and what it means. Or worse, they know and have realized that the state is violence and inherently illegitimate, but they think it's a necessary evil. Or, I always like the statement or the phrase that the state is an unnecessary evil. Basically,
it so is. It so is. There's a great article by Lou Rockwell called "Why I Am an Anarcho-Capitalist," and he goes, "Minarchists, your society would be preferable, but what you're going to have to do, what you're going to have to expect of the public, is to teach them the bad things about price control, rent control, minimum wage, farm subsidies, invading countries, like." Years and years of research you're going to have to explain to the public and get them to accept, while the anarcho-capitalist expects of the public non-aggression principle, self-ownership, and property rights, things we already apply to each other. We just need to apply also to a group called the Congress group, the police group, and the government group. So that is a great article that I'm making a video of in the process.
I should make sure to put that in the show notes page after this, because these are all good references and resources for us. But you, so next, you want to move on next to what the state is? We've kind of been covering that.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Well, actually, we've just been covering things that happen from the state. We're not getting at the root. So here is what Franz Oppenheimer, Rothbard quotes on page 14, pointed out. There are two mutually exclusive ways of acquiring wealth. One, above way of production and exchange, he called the economic means. The other is simpler in that it does not require productivity. It is the way of seizure of another's goods or services by the use of force and violence. So he has the economic means and the political means. The political means is force. There's work and force, as he goes on to explain. Work and robbery, I'm sorry, is how Oppenheimer describes the state. And the state is pure robbery. Not sometimes. Everything it has stolen. So that is what the state is. It's the institution that has a monopoly on territory. It is not acquired through voluntary trade or original appropriation. And it has the monopoly on law, including cases that it's involved in, which is such a conflict of interest. I can't believe people still fall for it. And the second thing is they have a monopoly on the ability to lay taxes. Again, the example I use is if Walmart said, we get to tax everyone, and everyone said no. And they said, well, every 4 years you'll get to vote for a Walmart CEO. Would that then be justified? Of course not. We have to hold organizations to the same principles, or else we're just saying these rules for this group, this rule for that group. And that's not a consistent way to deal with organizations in society.
Yeah, and I guess the biggest question then is trying to ask minarchists or statists, I guess, what is the process by which we delegate these rights to public officials, and how exactly does that happen? And I mean, I guess they say voting or whatever, but I mean, in a direct one-on-one situation like that. And I wanted to touch on too the appropriation or the exploitation argument, actually, because a lot of people will say that capitalism is exploitative. It's and they get into the labor theory of value, which for me is when I stop engaging, because that doesn't make sense, the labor theory of value. But the political means is a zero-sum game. One side clearly benefits, whereas voluntary exchange is not a zero-sum game. If both parties didn't gain something from the transaction would never take place. Or if both parties didn't subjectively believe that they were gaining something from the transaction, then the transaction wouldn't take place. I mean, what we're really talking about here is the difference between a zero-sum transaction and one that is voluntary where both parties benefit.
On page 16, he makes a great point saying, production must always precede predation. Work precedes the theft of that work. The free market is anterior to the state. In other words, it's not this idea that there's state capitalism or cronyism really is capitalism. No, it's not. It is the theft of capitalism. And by definition, voluntary private exchange is not violence and theft. It's literally like saying the non-aggression principle is also the aggression principle. So there is no way to conflate these two things, and doing so is just completely dishonest. He gives a theory of how states come to arise. So instead of one group going, murdering people and taking over the land, it's much easier to invade the land of a different country, kill the ruler, claim rulership over those people, and take a product of their labor over time. It's hard to get into the validity of that theory, but certainly it's important to mention. Albert J. Nock is someone he quotes on Doing the Right Thing in other essays. He goes, the state is a total contradiction. He goes, it forbids private murder, but it itself organizes murder on a colossal scale. It punishes private theft, but it lays unscrupulous hands on anything it wants, whether the property of citizen or an alien. So that is the end of that chapter. Any thoughts on holding the state to different principles than we hold other groups to?
Well, not precisely that, but I wanted to. I know I've mentioned this before when we've interviewed, but just talking about Stefan Molyneux's video, the story of your enslavement, and realizing how the state comes to be, is that when you get a party that basically enslaves, what Rothbard proposes is that they conquer a people and then they just install themselves as the oligarchs of that civilization. And then they've realized that, and this is what I think the evolution of capitalism as we know it, is that these oligarchs started realizing that they can siphon more off the top if people are more productive by allowing them to choose their own tasks, by allowing the division of labor and subjectively letting the people think that they're free, therefore they can choose their own path and be more productive. So it's that predation, it's the crony capitalism, I think has emerged as the the most productive order and the most prosperous for the oligarchs, is that if we think we're free to a certain level and they allow us to be free to a certain level, we don't realize that we're enslaved. And that's, it's like it's a crony capitalist mercantilist kind of system, kind of fascist, with this union between political or private interests in the state. So does that sum up the chapter pretty well?
It does, yeah. And just my final point on this is the reason you will get state growth and decrease of freedoms over time, that's theorized for the populace as a whole, is because it benefits certain private interests at the expense of the public at large. So when the public is taxed like $2 a year for farm subsidies, they're not going to say, stop farm subsidies, this is horrible. They're just going to say, that's terrible, but okay. Oh, it helps workers? All right, whatever. But the farmers who get millions of dollars, they spend their entire lives lobbying for it. So when that happens in every single industry again and again and again, over time, these things start to snowball. And that's how you get from limited constitution, 10 rules, to like these millions of pages of regulations and even their own laws they don't even follow. So that's my my final point on that. The next chapter is how the state preserves itself.
This is my favorite.
So this support, it must be noted, need not be active enthusiasm, claiming that states need the support of the populace. It may well be passive resignation, as if to be an inevitable law of nature. So it's not that the people need to consent to the laws, it's that they need to not forcibly resist them. And that's a very important difference. He says active resistance is pretty much any government can be overthrown by active resistance against enough people. I think the American Revolution, it took like 3% of people to actively resist. The chief task of the rulers is always to secure the active or resigned acceptance of the majority of citizens. One method of securing support is through the creation of vested economic interests. Consent of the majority. For the essential acceptance, the majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, using terms like death and taxes. And it's at least better than all the alternatives. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, that's so true, and I guess part of what that Stefan Molyneux video, The History of Your Enslavement, is he gets into the there's a class that's actively created by government of people who depend upon the government for their own subsistence, and those people will enforce and keep the rest of the public in line in order to preserve the status quo, because they're sucking off the teat. And I think this is public servants. Particularly, they get their state pensions or their pensions and their fat salary from the state with benefits that wouldn't exist in the private sector. This happened in Wisconsin, and I'm not a fan of Governor Scott Walker at all, but this happened in Wisconsin when Scott Walker was elected. Then they had a recall, which he won, but he wanted to cut the benefits of the teachers' unions and get rid of collective bargaining and stuff like that and reduce their benefits. And, there was this huge uproar. And I was sitting there like, well, teachers still have, even after the cuts he's proposing, teachers still have benefits that would never exist in the private sector. They are sitting on fat cushions. And so that's just a blatant example of a class being dependent on the government and enforcing their dictates on the rest of us because they're dependent on that government system. And yeah, it's just, you see it everywhere. And whether it's, the prison guards unions lobbying for mandatory minimum sentences and stuff like that, that you see it there. But my favorite, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's an interesting part in The Conscience of a Liberal by Paul Krugman where he goes, so here's the history of the welfare state. Bismarck in Germany implemented a welfare state to secure the Kaiser's rule. And then he just moves on as if that isn't huge. The invention of the welfare state was to get people socially dependent. So even if they are like, the Kaiser's totally illegitimate, it's like, well, that is my monthly check. So
Yeah.
people like Matt Zwolinski who are like, or Mike Munger who are like, we should support a universal basic income. At least it's better than all this other stuff. Do you know how hard it is to get people to not only stop worshiping their god government, but to get them to give up checks that just start flowing in every month? It's so incredible. And even when they realize the history of it, in America, we have the Cloward and Piven strategy, which was implemented to get people on welfare dependent on the state, bankrupt the welfare state to justify a Bolshevik revolution.
Mhm.
That's proven. Cloward and Piven strategy, no theory, only factual. About the intellectuals, what you were saying is interesting.
Yes, my favorite.
The state needs intellectuals to say, God isn't government virtuous, God isn't government legitimate, and all this stuff, and create all these theories. But he goes, why do intellectuals need the state? Why don't they just say, no, it's not, and think critically? The reason is the average person is so not interested in reading the most important book ever, along with The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose. So they can secure their position where they can just get a state position and not have to provide any goods that people demand. Whereas in the private sector, if you don't meet consumer demand for a week or a month or a year, you're finished. And that's why there's a profit and loss system. That is the socialist calculation problem. But that was such a brilliant insight as to how the two feed off one another and why states always get into education. Yeah, because they want an educated populace. Yeah, right.
Right.
That's why they conceal like 90% of their documents under top secret, and speaking out against the government's illegal.
Well, and I wanted to, because I'm so interested in the progressive era. And I haven't had time to really dive into it yet, but I'm reading Rothbard's The Progressive Era and the Thomas C. Leonard's American Economics and Eugenics in the Progressive Era. And that Thomas C. Leonard is a Princeton lecturer. So you got that Ivy League kind of mainstream credentials there. Just mind-boggling. Just the emergence of this class of people who wanted to, it started in religious, Protestant religious New England old families realizing, hey, we can't make money as, private intellectuals. So they rent seek and go to the state where they realize they want to use the state, crush laissez-faire individualism, put on this collectivism, what we've come to know. And this is ever present still in the progressive era. It's still the same stuff. And they realize they abandon the church and private activism and charities towards affecting public discourse and the way the times are going, and they adopt the state as the primary means of affecting change in society. And we see this so ever presently. And they were rabid eugenicists, talking about the minimum wage laws to exclude blacks and the unfit and minorities from the workforce to wean off their kind. And I'm quoting direct language here from Woodrow Wilson's labor secretary, Meeker, forget his first name. But so you're seeing this so blatantly and emerging in the progressive era, and it's so ever present in the modern progressive movement. It is still there. The underlying eugenics is still there. They just don't realize it. They're just as racist. They don't realize that, but they don't realize that the impetus behind what they're saying and the genesis of these ideas is so baked in very apparent upfront racism and eugenics. And that's just, mind-boggling.
It is, yeah. On page 23, he makes a very interesting insight. He goes, the state and intellectuals have induced their subjects to support their rule. He talks about the best example being the union of church and state was one of the oldest and most successful of these ideological devices. Any resistance to his rule, the king, would be blasphemy. So right then and there, today we don't have the word blasphemy, we have the word treason. And I slipped when I said you can't talk out against the government. I mean, it has the right to suppress whistleblowers or people who talk about its secret information. And you can just imagine if anyone else did that. Hey, have you committed a murder? Those documents are classified, officer. Goodbye. And then shut the door in his face. Yeah, right. He would say that. So they instill fear of any alternative systems of non-rule or rule in and of itself. And it's so funny. He's saying this decades ago, and we constantly hear today, no matter how bad the government gets, it's like, well, without us, things would be horrible. Like, how many atrocities does the government have to commit overseas until we're like, maybe not getting in there would have been better? Can you just say that with every system? Sometimes it's true in the way that the Bolshevik Revolution was worse than the czars previously. But yeah, it's constantly saying, at least we're not that bad, which is the logic of beating the hell out of your wife and saying, but I know a husband who's killed his wife. Don't stop complaining about me. If you don't like being married to me, move to Somalia.
Yeah.
So again, we would never hold anyone else except our God, the state, to these ridiculous standards.
Yeah, or you can't leave because how would you eat if I wasn't going to work? You know, back to your abusive husband. How would you eat if I wasn't going to work to support you, or you know, such and such argument? But so, anything else about the opinion molders of society?
Oh my God, I got more notes on this than I remembered.
The scientism or belief in just science. I mean, that's the modern iteration of it, is that, you know, we have the experts, and the experts in the intelligence community, the experts in the climate change community have decided that climate change is man-made. God dang it. And
even so, let's say that it is. They never justify why state intervention is superior to the market response to these problems. Governments didn't invent the Prius. Governments are not going to be at the cutting edge of new technology that is good for the environment. I asked Rand Paul, I'm like, what are some of the talking points you use when talking to government advocates? And he goes, well, I talk about how the reason our air today is cleaner than it was in 1980 is not because the EPA writes down rules and builds all these barriers to entry so only big corporations can comply with them and their competition smacked out. He goes, the reason is because of entrepreneurs, innovation, free trade, and free exchange of ideas. I thought that was a great point.
Oh yeah, and I was going to say this little device right here has saved more trees than Greenpeace has.
Absolutely.
So
well, yeah. My thing, I have 2 terabytes of information, and the thing is literally this big and this wide. That is like the library closest to my house can fit entirely in PDFs on those 2 terabytes. It's absolutely incredible. So the way is always to innovate, not to save us, John McCain, save us, Nancy Pelosi and Barney Frank. Is Bernie working on environmental problems? I'm sure he can solve it. Can't understand basic economics, but he's going to solve the energy crisis, assuming there is one.
Of course.
Okay, back to this. He goes, fear of other state rulers is what they constantly talk about. They're like, what about? Well, the presidents of the United States have, aligned themselves with the Saddams, as the Rumsfeld picture. That one is just so unbelievable. They have no problem aligning themselves with Stalin. There's that great image. There's that great meme of Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Starts a war to save Poland, gives Poland to Stalin. And it's just so incredible that they'll make you fear other rulers, even though they are the ones exploiting you the most. He goes, people identify, the state identifies itself with the territory it governed. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its people with the state was a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. first task of the state and its intellectuals was to convince the people of Ruritania that the attack was really among them. So if there's an attack, if someone says, we hate US government policies, we're going to commit atrocity A, the government's going to say, they attacked you. Look at what they did to you guys, or us. Look at what they did to us. It's like, no way. I don't hate any Russians. I hate Joseph Stalin and his government. I don't hate any Chinese people. I hate Mao Zedong. I don't think anyone in Iraq deserved to be bombed, but Saddam certainly deserved a bullet in the head. And same thing with North Korea today. Austin Peterson even is like, so we're just going to let them sit there while they threaten us? What do you mean they, Peterson? 25 million North Koreans. How many of them do you think are involved in the threat against America? One asshole, and you're going to justify another war. Peterson pisses me off so often.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, you get this so blatantly, and I apologize for the word choice I'm about to drop. But in Vietnam, you get the black community, the African American community, saying, no Vietnamese ever called me nigger.
Yeah.
And
yeah, well, that was Muhammad Ali's famous line.
Was that his famous line? Okay.
Yeah, that was Muhammad Ali.
But that's so true. You convince people that there's a bunch of people across the world that hate them that we've never met. I know people in my hometown, which is a small town in Wisconsin, and people there just hate all Arabs, and they hate Muslims because they think that it's every Muslim in the Middle East wants to kill us, when obviously we know that's not the case. And yeah,
for the same reason I don't hold all Iraqis responsible for Saddam's atrocities or all North Koreans responsible for Kim Jong-un, is mainly they're the victims of them. Number two, I'll just go up to a leftist and say, so I can blame you for Trump. At least you get to vote. They think that's legitimate, but you get to vote. In North Korea, they don't get to vote. All right, Mr. Conservative, so I get to hold you responsible for Barack Obama's health care plan, taking between 6 and 9 million people out of their insurance plans after promising that wouldn't happen. So you cannot hold the populace responsible for what the politicians do. You can't hold the slaves responsible for what the master does, but they always use them as pawns. Rothbard makes an unbelievable point here. He goes, a war between peoples within each people coming to the defense of its rulers. Of all groups, you defend your elites. It's really important, the Christmas truce of 1914, where on the World War I, they thought would end much sooner. But in 1914, the British and the German armies, I'm pretty sure that this is verified. There's a whole wiki page and multiple sources on it. They ended up playing games together and interacting with each other without violence for Christmas Day. Then the next day they went to go back to kill each other, meaning it wasn't a war because all Germans hated all all British people who hated all Belgians or who hated all the French people. It's literally rulers hating rulers, telling their subject class to hate the other group, and then the groups fighting one another when they have no beef at all. Just like you said, no Viet Cong ever called me nigger. That is such a brilliant point. So, like years of history refuted by Muhammad Ali, right there.
Yeah, right. I mean, what a statement. And well, I was going to say about the Christmas truce, how I had the a video testimony from a soldier that was there. I cut into my Liberation Library 5 episode, or 4, Blood Makes the Green Grass Grow. And he was saying that the way that they got them to start fighting again the next day, because they were still hobnobbing with the enemy, was that a British soldier walked up to a German guy as they were sitting there together and shot him right in front of everyone. And so there you get the state actor, the officers in charge, coming up and just shooting a German soldier that was hobnobbing with the British guy. And so, I mean, mankind has that natural, deep-seated, I think, instinctual need for peace and not to kill fellow man. I think somewhere along the lines of civilization, we developed these, and you could allude to the 10 Commandments, we developed these rules for living civilized. And the state gets to break them. Somewhere that was lost.
final point on how the state preserves itself. He goes, the greatest danger to the state is an independent intellectual criticism. There's no better way to stifle that criticism than to attack any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. They depreciate the individual and exalt the collective of society. So by calling you terms like conspiracy theorist, he again goes into making the same state inevitable, death and taxes. Anyone who blames state rulers has their motives assumed and says they are conspiracy theories, as the CIA popularized in a document 1035-960 to counter criticize any questioning of the Warren Commission. That was a total fraud. He goes, the state will often not blame state rulers, but mysterious and arcane social forces. And then he goes on to say that the state induces guilt in the populace. You're too rich. You're only free because Native American atrocities and stuff like that. But by calling someone a conspiracy theorist, you can never address the real problem. This group committed an atrocity. They just go, hey, you know what? Terrorism happens. War is hell. There is collateral damage. Collateral damage is how I just talked to a guy yesterday who I said, does the U.S. have the right to kill civilians in other countries? Do they have the right to do it here? And he goes, well, that's collateral damage. That happens. It's war. He just talks about it as if it's the sun rising. And this guy is very wealthy. He owns his own law firm. That's as far as I'll go with saying who it is. But it goes to show you, someone who goes 8 years of college, has all this knowledge, can't see right in front of his eyes. He wouldn't say 9/11 was just collateral damage. Of course, I don't believe the official 9/11 story. But even if you do, imagine saying, well, this is war. That, 9/11 happens. They would never say that. Again, the state fears intellectual criticism more than anything else. And that, and then he finishes with talking about the science thing, the god of science, where they just claim we have intellectuals, even if they're wrong about babies in incubators, WMDs in Iraq, the Lusitania carrying ammunitions, whether or not the Japanese will attack the island of Hawaii, even though it wasn't a state until 1959. And no matter how wrong the intelligence agencies are, people still see them as, oh, that's science and that's legitimate. Science is a method, not a group of people with badges or coats or ties. So when they say, here's how economics works, well, none of them saw the collapse coming. Peter Schiff did. Ayn Rand warned about it. Rothbard did. Ron Paul warned about it. And they specified the housing bubble is where it will occur. They didn't just say, eventually it's going to rain. 10 years later, it rains. See, I told you, eventually everything's going to happen. They specified why and who the culprits are. Fannie, Freddie, Community Reinvestment Act. So no matter how many times the state's high priest class, you could call them, are proven to be absolute morons, they still have legitimacy because they cannot face intellectual criticism, what they fear the most.
Yeah, and because excuse me, because of the progressive era, they've rent-seeked right into the states. So we have this bureaucracy. And we were going to talk about Ludwig von Mises's bureaucracy as well. And this is an aside anecdote, but I was in the journal, Public Policy Journal at my school, and I wrote this screed against drug prohibition. And the guy after me, he's like, I see you've quoted this book called Bureaucracy. Are you aware that at one point in time, bureaucracy was upheld as the best way, a revolutionary way to manage society? Are you aware that this bureaucracy was a great, great invention? It was just ridiculous, man. And that's what it is.
Chapter 4, how the state transcends its limits. He calls this, they transform concepts into intellectual rubber stamps of legitimacy. Kings may rule only according to the divine law. Democracy is a check on rulers. So people never even consider, okay, what does it mean to tax the public Or if you steal money from the IRS, who says they earned it in the first place? It uses these key terms to justify itself and transcend limits we would otherwise put on private actors. Roderick T. Long mentioned in in just a Twitter comment that yes, education is needed to counter the power-hungry people in society, but what's needed more is checks and balances, and only a libertarian anarchist society really has true checks and balances. Giving the state a monopoly on violence, laws, and taxes is not checks and balances. I mean, it would be like saying we need Walmart to run America, but Walmart has to have other areas of Walmart to counteract its ideas. Or the Rockefeller Foundation needs to have one department that regulates another, and that's checks and balances. No, it's not. Not at all.
Yeah, and people love democracy, you know. What about the supreme democracy of voting with the dollar? You know, every dollar that you spend brings about a change in the world. So maybe if, you know, you should be more careful about where you're sending your money. And I think I don't know who had a great point about this, but I saw it was on Twitter or something like that. But every penny that you spend is a vote and brings about a change in the world. So if you decry, or if you talk about democracy being the ultimate end, well, what is the ultimate democracy?
Sure. And anything you say, well, the state needs to do X because private companies can be, insert bad thing private companies can do. The reason libertarian anarchism, voluntarism, is superior to monopoly is because anything that can happen in a private company can also happen in a state monopoly. And when it happens in a state monopoly, there's no voluntarily opting out. With private, there always is. So just on its level, it's always better to have private corruption than government corruption. It's much more easy to combat, and people don't imagine private groups have the right to coercively rule on territories they have not acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So where are we at then in terms of the book? I wanted to make a point, I guess, about the courts just being rubber stamps. And I kind of got into this with my last episode with Lysander Spooner talking about jury nullification. But essentially, I don't understand where the disconnect is in the mainstream with realizing ultimately that the courts are a party to the dispute. Even so, in the modern court monopoly system, even the attorneys, once you pass the bar, you are considered to be an agent of the court. And you have certain duties to the court and certain duties to other agents of the court, which include other attorneys. So not only is and maybe this, I don't know, someone might argue that I'm being naive, but not only is the judge a party to its own dispute, if we're arguing issues of constitutionality, not only is the judge a party to the suit, but both the plaintiff and the defendant are both agents of the state itself. Both attorneys are. Both litigants are agents of the state because they're being represented by an agent of the court.
Just imagine two General Electric people regulating each other. We would see automatically they're on the same side. Two people from Goldman Sachs are going to really go at it. No, they're not. Not really. Even though they are two different individuals, by being part of this apparatus, they generally have the same interests. So again, just imagine if it was a private company doing it. But when the state does it, it's supposed to be totally different.
Well,
so
and the legislature appoints the judges in a lot of cases too. So how are judges that are appointed by the legislature supposed to strike down unconstitutional laws made by the legislature?
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So it's not always, judges aren't always appointed by the legislature, but you get what I mean.
Rothbard goes on to say they transcend their limits by using legitimate sounding things like natural rights as proposed by John Locke, and then turning them into something like, yeah, we believe in rights. Like you have a right to a job, you have a right to healthcare, you have a right to a house, without addressing the principle behind what a right is, meaning what the libertarian idea of a right is you have the right to commit any action that does not consist of initiating violence against any other person or property. Whereas that can be then taken to, we have a right to food, therefore I have the right to forcibly have you produce food for me, and I get to take your property by force if I then pursue food with that stolen property. So they take these things that are generally accepted. We need to defend ourselves. Of course you need to defend yourself. Wait, you want to disarm us? You just said you wanted to defend us. And then they'll say, therefore, agency must have the ultimate decision on constitutionality. That is a monopoly. Ask any economist, why shouldn't there be a specially privileged monopoly on food or cell phones or book printing? And every reason they'll give you is a much better reason for why the state should not have a monopoly on taxes or producing laws.
That gets into, there's a great quote by Hans Hermann Hoppe in the Economics and Ethics of Private Property, and I'm going to pull it up now. You keep going, but I want to get back to it about the public goods theory. I'll read it for us, but let me grab it.
Oh, there's a great quote on page 40. With states tyrannizing over their citizens, only vetoing the federal government when it tries to intervene to stop that state tyranny, what is to prevent federal government and state governments from forming mutually profitable alliances for the joint exploitation of the citizenry? This is the ultimate justification, is what they're going to use to have a United Nations. They're going to get together and say, look, we don't like war, so we have the League of Nations after World War I. They never say, that didn't work, let's not do that again. It was used to lure Germany into starting another war, but that's a whole nother thing. States will often align themselves with each other so they can further exploit their own populaces. The perfect analogy is, if you have two slave owners and slaves, do you, as the slave, have more in common with the slaves of that other group or more in common with your master? You, the subjects of countries, have much more in common with each other than you do your own ruler. So for you to take the ruler's side in a dispute against another country is purely illogical.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Did you find that quote?
I did, yeah. So this is on the public goods theory, but so let's see who Hans Hermann Hoppe is quoting Gustave de Molinari. And Gustave de Molinari says, if there is one well-established truth in political economy, it is this, that in all cases of all commodities that serve to provide for the tangible or intangible need of the consumer, it is in the consumer's best interest that labor and trade remain free, because the freedom of labor and trade have as their necessary and permanent result the maximum reduction of price. And this, that, so he says that, and he says either this is true, or else the principles on which economic science is based are invalid. So you got to follow there's rules in economics and you have to follow it. And for some reason, in these certain commodities and services, for some reason, socialists try and explain that the rules, the fundamental rules, like the rules of gravity, don't apply to those goods and services or those commodities.
That's why I constantly tell conservatives to stop supporting a socialist court system and a socialist police force and a socialist military and a socialist food and drug administration. For all the same reasons, socialists shouldn't monopolize, the state shouldn't monopolize production of computers, applies literally consistently. There's nothing magical about law or order. Great book on this is Private Governance by Edward Stringham. You could find a ton of, I have an interview with him on my show, and he gives a ton of talks as well. Rothbard makes a great consistent application of logic here. He goes, just as the right of nullification for a state logically implies, meaning world government countries should have the right to not be in a world government because that inflicts on their sovereignty. Just as the right of the nullification for a state logically implies its right of secession, so a right of individual nullification would imply the right of any individual to secede from the state under which he lives. I mentioned this in my discussion with Larry Sharp. I said, people are so worried about the Russians interfering with us and getting into our business, even though Obama did the same thing in Britain with Brexit. And the same thing when he endorsed Emmanuel Macron in the French election. But if you're really worried about other groups imposing their will, the state imposes their will on every state. The federal government imposes its will on every state. The state does on every city. The city does on every individual. Just use their own logic and say what you're saying, not let me push voluntarism on you. What you're saying is you believe in voluntarism, self-ownership, and the non-aggression principle just by your own values.
Yeah, that's such a good point to illustrate it. Using their own logic and something that they understand. And I think I had a video about this when I was doing the daily vlog series. That was kind of short-lived. But just saying that one thing Rothbard does in For New Liberty is use things within the statist lexicon and flipping it on its head. You know, things appealing to the traditional values of conservatives and flipping it on their head using their own logic. And that works well. I think one was with, magazines. You know, why would we want a monopoly on magazines? The free market is reigned in magazines, and we have all this different expression of opinion and all these different cornucopia of different magazines. Well, why would we want a monopoly on the public school system? If we have the magazines and we know the First Amendment is important in facilitating free ideas, wouldn't it be even more detrimental to free expression to socialize schooling? So I think that was a pretty good argument.
So Rothbard finishes the chapter, I'm pretty sure it's the same chapter, with explaining how parts of international law were originally purely private, growing out of the need of merchants and traders everywhere to protect their property and adjudicate disputes. The American Arbitration Association, I believe, is private. Everything you do on Amazon that something goes wrong is private. Any problem with your Visa card between Visa and MasterCard or American Express is a private dispute. I've never been in a dispute where I'm like, look, this is confusing. We need a government to get involved in this. Government never improves it because they have no incentive, and coercively funding arbitrators is inherently immoral. He uses examples are admiralty law and the law of the merchant, meaning, look, even California and Arizona have like thousands of different laws. No one knows what they are. No one's read them. What people do is they trade based on natural law, laws that have arisen just out of trade and tradition. Doesn't make them inherently moral. Tradition does not make something moral, but it gives you a prime example of how two people with totally different groups interact because it's to their mutually beneficial exchange to do so.
Yeah, and
so that is a perfect explanation of how the state's illegitimate. By the way, we can do it without a coercive monopoly.
Oh, yeah, and I can really rip off this, and I'm really glad that you mentioned admiralty courts and the merchant system, because I'm learning about this in my commercial law class right now, is that, so I also learned about this through Bruce L. Benson's book, The Enterprise of Law, and so what happened in the Middle Ages, essentially, as kind of before the dawn of the Enlightenment era, is that you had merchants all across Europe figuring out the merchant's code. And what they did, it was this customary system of voluntary law completely transcending borders that was created explicitly by merchants trading. And what they did was it bubbled up from the customs and all the transactions that were happening between the merchants already, created a body of law that governed all commercial transactions within Europe for a period of time. And I don't have the dates on me, but this is anarchy. This essentially is law coming about out of custom and out of the way that transactions work. And this is current in the United States, actually. And it's not 100% libertarian, but the entire United States, every state has adopted what is called the Uniform Commercial Code. And oh, I wish I had it. It's across the room over here. I'd grab it, but it's this thick book and it has different articles in it. But what it is that I forgot the guy's name, but he created the Uniform Commercial Code in like the 50 or maybe earlier, but essentially what he did, and he was a free market type that believed in natural law bubbling up from the commercial transactions of everyone in the United States doing business the same way. So we have this tome called the Uniform Commercial Code, which every state has enacted. It governs all commercial transactions, all secured transactions that happen in the United States, and it's entirely based off of the actual customs that businesses use to transact with each other. And I think, and it's a lot more loose than the common law system. And the main purpose of it is to facilitate these transactions and to let this customary system build. And I think it's fascinating. I wanted to do an episode on it, but funny you get into admiralty law too, because I was researching that for another episode that I have planned. But essentially, the U.S. Coast Guard is imprisoning people indefinitely on these floating prisons all across the high seas. And the logistics have to do with due process and how long you can detain someone because of the fact that you're out in the middle of the ocean, and it might be 3 weeks before you go to a port of call. But the entire admiralty law system works in anarchy right now because there's different zones in the ocean. And the entire way they figure out jurisdiction is based under which flag you're flying under. So if you're on a cutter and you're out in the high seas in international waters and you're intercepted by, let's say, a U.S. vessel, well, whatever flag you're flying under is, if you're in international waters, whatever flag you are flying under, you are subject to that jurisdiction. So if you float into the U.S. territorial waters, then you're under U.S. jurisdiction. And it depends on the territorial waters. But if you're on the high seas, it depends on what flag you're flying under. And how is that any different than having a private dispute company represent you? That's just your flag. That would be your private flag. And maybe your private dispute company has standing agreements with other private dispute companies, other flags, if you will. And you can figure it out. I mean, they've figured this stuff out. It's not, I mean, courts specialize in figuring this stuff out. So it'll work. Sorry for that. Yeah.
No, that's great. Because it's in their interest to do so. Roderick T. Long has a great analogy where he goes, why aren't there octagon credit cards? There's no law against making a credit card that's shaped like an octagon, but the reason they're generally in this shape is because there is a constant interest for people to work together. I mean, shoe size is another one. Why isn't there... how is a size 13 of Nike very similar to a size 13 of a Reebok brand? That is, I literally can't think of one other shoe producer, but they're constantly, okay, how can I get Gmails, how can I communicate with someone who has a Hotmail or an AOL? Don't we need government to oversee this? No, it's in their interest. Don't
why are all pop cans? Pop cans. Why are all pop cans the same size? Sorry.
Why do CDs all fit in the same cassette place? How come I can call people with Verizon on Sprint? Or AT&T? And
there's no legislation governing that necessarily. That says all pop cans or all chip bags have to be the same size, or all records have to be the same size. I mean, all pens have to look a certain way or operate with the same mechanism. I mean, these things just develop naturally.
I know. Imagine this little wire right here. Why doesn't it just have like 50 little things shooting out of it? Can't someone make that? What if a private company made that? They could, but it's not to their interest, because the incentive exists in voluntary societies is the reason you get so much cooperation on this level. And everything I have cooperates with this and my USB stick because there's an incentive to do so.
Well, and
It's so obvious.
Well, and it's just crazy because we're sitting here and we're just pulling things off of our desk to illustrate this point, you know?
I know.
And I mean, I have the screw here. How come all the screw heads fit the same way? Did someone make a law saying that, you know, we have Phillips, we have Standard, and we have, you know, some bureaucrat sat down and thought, well, man, wouldn't it just make sense to have all screw heads be the same?
I can imagine Bernie Sanders right now. Here is how we're going to work cell phones. You're so dumb. You think these people are the ones who are going to make society efficient, who are going to allow us to trade without very high costs? You're kidding yourself. Nancy Pelosi can't even structure a sentence. She still thinks George Bush is president.
Right.
This woman cannot do shit, but you're like, oh God, without them, just no one, we wouldn't be able to trade. I'd want to go to Patrick's house, but there'd be no road without
Right.
Barney Frank. I mean, without Barney Frank running that prostitution ring out of his house, there'd be no, without the Franklin cover up, things would go bad. I mean, Jesus, come on, people.
Yeah.
Finally,
Yes.
last chapter of the book, history as a race between state power and social power. The anarcho-communists and the minarchists often fear that, well, instead of state power, if we don't have that, then there's just going to be like private power. The difference is interactions between men are peaceful cooperation or coercive exploitation. So the history of mankind, particularly its economic history, may be considered as a contest between these two principles. So by leader, we could say who is the leader of maybe a movement like Black Lives Matter. The black man Sean King, I think, is the head of that, along with Cenk Uygur. But just look at movements that are voluntary. Who's the head of cell phones? Well, we had people like Steve Jobs. Now we have guys like Tim Cook. We have innovators. We have Elon Musk, even though he's a welfare whore. But we have people in philosophy, Robert Nozick, Jason Brennan, who I also have a great talk with on my channel. There are voluntary leaders who emerge as the result of individual demand, people clicking on their videos, people buying their books. That is nothing like president, because I can opt out of working with under the CEO of General Electric. I don't have the right to opt out of Donald Trump. He refers to Albert J. Nock's book, Our Enemy the State, referring to social power and state power being two ways of how society can move forward. So it's not like, well, there shouldn't be people in high places. It's like, who's the authority on history? How do we know how things happened? Well, people develop reputations, and others voluntarily choose to accept their word based on their reputations or the stamps of approval they get from other people or organizations. Social power is the way to move forward. It's voluntary. You can opt out of it. There's no violence. Whereas state power is the exact opposite. So I think that's a great way that he ended the book in. My analysis will stop there. If do you have any last words on the book?
Not too much. I mean, except the fact I just would reiterate that, you know, I really think the difference between minarchists and anarchists is those who have internalized the lessons in this book and the reality, the truth of these lessons, and those who haven't. And, you know, I guess I'll end with the question of how much do you hate the state?
Okay, I lied. I'm just going to go into this book and read one quick part, because it literally says, here's what we're dealing with when we're talking about political authority, rather than authority on history or authorities on engineering. Political authority, the hypothesized moral property in virtue of which governments may coerce people in certain ways not permitted to anyone else, and in virtue of which citizens must obey governments in situations in which they would not be obligated to obey anyone else. Again, this book is so important, and you can't get the average person to read this. So we need to read it, understand it, and be able to communicate it effectively. Maybe some ways better than others, being in their face about it, embarrassing statists on videos, that might help delegitimize the statist opinion. Also, nonviolent communication is an unbelievable way, even though people get really worked up. When you can use something as simple as nonviolent communication. Adam Kokesh is great at man on the street interviews, as well as a guy named Cal Monolet, I believe his name is. He has a YouTube channel. Let me find it real quick. He's terrific at using this nonviolent approach to communicate ideas or just asking questions. K-A-L, first name Cal, last name Molinet. He has a terrific way of approaching these things. He can talk to left, right, minarchist. He's just terrific. So that is our problem and two possible solutions to how we can understand the anatomy of the state and defeat it by intellectually criticizing it and thinking about it.
Yeah, and I mean, let me just end as the housekeeper is vacuuming in the hallway outside my apartment, so apologies if you can hear that. But let me just end on that point by saying, independent intellectual criticism, that's the way forward. Prof. CJ of the Dangerous History podcast phrases it as guerrilla scholar warriors. And I gave a talk at the Agora Symposium on Saturday, kind of discussing this, but this is the way forward. There's an explosion right now of people just like us, normal guys that have YouTube channels. We're talking about these things. We're criticizing the state from an intellectual perspective. And, you're doing great work. We have a lot of friends in this network that's emerging right now, right before our eyes. And I think it's important to support that and to consume the media. So with that being said, do you want to plug your stuff one last time?
I would just ask people to follow, subscribe to my channel, Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. And you can follow me on Twitter at @AN_capitalist. Patrick, thanks so much for having me on for such a great topic, man. Yeah. Always great to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, I love doing stuff. I love when we get to talk, and it's always a pleasure. Once again, the show notes for this can be found at libertyweekly.net/LL5, and I'll put that up tomorrow. Otherwise, this will be on my BitChute channel, YouTube. Just search Liberty Weekly. Be sure to subscribe to my podcast. You'll find the links by going to libertyweekly.net. So that's been Anatomy of the State. Thanks so much for joining me, Keith.
Take care, man.